What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy the
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101, the place where we come together live almost every day of the week to hear directly from people who are in the news, and anyone who wants to can join to ask a question, share comments, or just listen. There's a reason why we do all of our events live. If you've ever sent a text or an email or a tweet, then you know that if you can't hear the voice of the person on the other side of the screen, or if you can't spend time around them, it can be really hard to gauge what that person is actually like, or how they think, or how they are. We hope that by bringing guests to you live, in their own voices and in their own words, we can break down barriers between centers of power in politics, journalism, academia, and you, and cut through the noise so even if you don't agree with what our guests say, you can get a better sense of what the institutions they serve actually do all day. Today, we're excited to release a portion of a live conversation and audience Q&A we had with Aaron David Miller. For almost 50 years, he has helped to guide the United States through some of its most difficult challenges around the world. He's been a trusted advisor to 6 U.S. Secretaries of State and really to every Republican and Democrat president since 1978. He's widely seen as a straight shooter who pulls no punches, and we really enjoyed talking to him. This was actually his 3rd time speaking with us. People from all around the world came to ask him questions. They all stuck around afterwards for a great post-show conversation. We really enjoyed it, and we hope you do too. As always, if you like what you hear, if you want to join us and listen live or ask an upcoming guest a question, if you want to hear past recorded episodes, or if you have any comments or suggestions for us, please go to our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Yeah, do you hear me now, Justin?
Yeah, we got you.
Loud and clear.
Terrific, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here as always. Justin, you run an extraordinary room, and one of the reasons is because people actually listen. And the guests you bring on, I think, are capable, certainly, of even doubting the validity of their own arguments. Very little is certain 6 to 8 months in a Biden administration, at least with respect to foreign policy. So I'm not here to sell anybody anything. I've thought a lot about this over the last 6-7 months. I've got some views on what I think is going on that may or may not reflect the views of everybody in this administration. But it's also an analysis of how the nature and character of the international environment has changed since Joe Biden was vice president, and certainly since he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So if it's okay, Justin, and I'll keep track of this so I won't take too much time, just like to lay out some initial thoughts as a sort of point of discussion for the hour. I'm a Star Trek fan, so the issue of prime directive, that organizing principle to govern the universe, and in this case, American foreign policy, to me is very simple. And that is, there's no single foreign policy challenge out there or combination of foreign policy challenges that is more potentially and imminently damaging to the Biden presidency, or I would argue to the future of the American Republic, than the 3 or 4 interlocked challenges that the president faces at home. I would contend with some perspective that he faces the greatest challenge, not so much of national recovery, although recovery is part of it, but he faces the greatest challenge of political, economic, and social challenges, I would argue, since any president since Franklin Roosevelt, without, and I think this is the critically important point, without the extraordinary margins in both the House and the Senate that many of our potentially transformative presidents, FDR wasn't alone, LBJ had majorities as well in Congress. So that's one basic reality, which I think informs how he looks at foreign policy, the priority of domestic issues. At the same time, there's a competing priority, and that is Biden believes deeply in the importance of U.S. leadership. Though, as I mentioned earlier, the world has changed profoundly, I would argue, since Biden was vice president and or chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I would put many of Biden's views in the aspirational category. Now, how he conceives of the American role, whether or not, to use one of the words of one of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, does he see the United States as an indispensable power? To quote de Gaulle, the cemeteries of France, de Gaulle argued, were filled with indispensable people. Or, in the words of my colleague and friend Bill Burns, who's now running the CIA, does he see the United States as sort of a pivotal power, able to pivot on a set of core issues and play a critical role in some, but not all of them? So I think the domestic priorities clash, in my judgment, with this aspirational view of foreign policy. I would argue the synthesis of the two, 7 or 8 months in, and we can argue about this, the synthesis of focusing on domestic priorities as opposed to promoting the idea of an expansive American role abroad, that synthesis more often than not has led to a policy of risk aversion, not risk readiness. Risk aversion in the sense that it's disciplined, it's well thought through for the most part. The relationship between means and ends are fairly well calibrated. The riskiest thing he's done, in my judgment, is to withdraw or set a date for withdrawal. That withdrawal is almost complete and probably will be by the end of July, first couple of weeks in August. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, something 3 of his predecessors were unable and or unwilling to do. Risky in the sense that I think we're in for some extremely rough times. I think the pictures out of Afghanistan post 9/11, and you're seeing them now, are going to be very ugly. He will be accused of betraying just about every goal the Americans set with respect to Afghanistan. The rights of women, minorities, stable governance, economic dynamism, purging corruption from the kleptocratic elite that runs Kabul. But I would also argue that the presence of 2,500 American forces under these circumstances would not address any of these issues with any kind of fulfillment in real terms, or even emotionally. Was no good time to withdraw from what emerged ultimately as an unwinnable war. The rest of his foreign policy, as I mentioned, I think is pretty risk averse. He's picked a lot of low hanging fruit. He's repaired relations with allies to a large degree. He's eliminated the Muslim ban. He confronts a serious problem at the border, which is no surprise, but there was nobody anticipated that problem would be addressed. He's rejoined several international organizations. He's taking climate seriously as his politics will allow him, at home and abroad. And I think he's re-injected to a certain degree, more on this later in our discussion, I'm sure, values into the frame of American foreign policy, something which his predecessors seemed to willfully either not care about or willfully went about eliminating from the frame of American foreign policy. I think on many of the major issues, U.S.-Russian relations, I think he'd like to see it stabilized. I think he'd like to rejoin the JCPOA if possible. He was not prepared for the May conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. He'd like to figure out a way to stabilize that as well. It's just that I don't see in his foreign policy what I would call an effort to transform any or all. I've left China for a minute. Any or all of the big issues, which in my judgment, frankly, through no fault of Joe Biden's, are untransformable. This is a world to be managed, not to be resolved. And I would challenge, I suppose this might be unfair, I would challenge anyone to identify a single issue out there of any consequence or significance that somehow is a consequence largely of American leadership, could somehow mystically, magically, practically be resolved in a sense that you could say, we're done with this issue. The Biden administration has addressed it comprehensively by itself, with others, with its allies, and some of the cooperation of its adversaries fixed this particular problem. I just don't see that happening. COVID was the single greatest world-altering event since the Second World War. It didn't so much as recreate the world as it reinforced existing tensions, contradictions, and trends, which create the world that we now live in. Great power competition, inherent mistrust of globalization, a plunge in the behavior of many democratic polities around the world, including our own. One final point before I finish. Nowhere, it seems to me, are the contradictions, tensions, anomalies, I would use the word hypocrisy, greater than the inherent tension between the promotion of American interests on one hand and values on the other. John McCain, for whom I had a lot of respect, even though I disagreed, and I had several opportunities to talk to him about his notion that American values equal American interests and American interests equal American values. I would argue to you simply that has never been the case in the last century of American foreign policy. We have rarely allowed our values to dominate and drive the discussion of our foreign policy or our behavior. And that is particularly apparent when it comes to intervention, responsibility to protect R2P in the face of mass killing and genocide. With the exception of Bosnia and a 3-month war against Serbia, I can think of not a single example in the last century in which the United States intervened anywhere to stop mass killing or genocide. The Nazi Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, South Sudan, Syria. There are reasons for that. People have written large books about it. And I think the Biden administration is confronted much with the same problem. And the only critique I would have, the basis of 2 articles, one for NPR and one in the Post, is that on one hand, he's divided the world into dictators and Democrats and cast that battle, that struggle, as the most important dynamic of the 21st century. And yet on the other, it's also business as usual when it comes to any number of relationships with authoritarians. And at some point, if he wants to deal, or if the world wants to deal seriously with the transnational problems, pandemic, climate, terrorism, preservation of biodiversity, I'm sure I forgot a few more, we're also going to need to employ the very authoritarian powers, or cooperate with the very authoritarian powers that Biden is now challenging and over whom he somehow wants to prevail. So that tension, I think, is there. I think he does it because he believes in it. He does it because it's very good domestic politics right now. And maybe if the midterms go his way, he might consider a more serious initiative toward China. And he does it in order to provide some correction to his predecessors' ignoring of these values. But as an effective strategy for managing American foreign policy, I'm not sure I entirely understand it. We can continue to promote our values, and we must. I just don't see the democratic dictator split as an effective, pragmatic, practical way to organize the rest of the world. There are just too many democracies out there, particularly in the global south, that have a lot of respect for what the Chinese have been doing, not so much in terms of their authoritarianism, but in terms of their developmental successes. So let me stop here.
Yeah, so what we're going to do, folks, is I'll probably ask 20 minutes of questions, and then we'll have maybe 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So again, if you want to get involved in this discussion, please raise your hand or send me a back channel. On that note, I think Aaron basically laid out a very good point that seemingly through rhetoric, President Biden's foreign policy is largely driven by our values and some combination of values and interests. Whereas opposed to the Trump administration, which was really focused on unilateral action, pulling out of multilateral organizations, undermining multilateral organizations. So think of the Paris Accord, think of the Iran nuclear deal, think of how President Trump approached the UN and NATO, and also really disregarding values and human rights and making a point to cozy up to dictators. President Biden has taken a different approach. So my first question, Aaron, trying to understand how you think a responsible president should approach foreign policy. What should be the driving factors in our foreign policy, and how should we manage them? Should it be something like you've railed against in your op-ed, where it's solely driven on human rights and democratic values? Should it be something, conversely, that is only driven on realpolitik, so national security, economic interests, or should there be some combination thereof, and how should we approach that?
You know, it's not a binary choice, and I would never deny the fact that to some degree in a democracy and democratic polity, our foreign policy must reflect our values. But the question of how you conduct yourself in today's world, all right, and let's remember, it is today's world we're talking about. This is not the, I would argue, the same as the three periods over the last 70 years or so where the United States really did do effective foreign policy, 45 to 50, where in fact we actually, the only war that left the United States stronger at home and stronger abroad with the capacity to influence events in Europe and in Asia, largely was a success. There were all sorts of failings during that period. The late 80s is another, or mid 70s under Nixon and Kissinger, despite all of the moral failings in and around Cambodia and Vietnam. There was the opening to China, there was détente, there was Kissinger's Middle East diplomacy. And finally, and I would argue I'm biased here because I worked for James Baker, but Bush 41 and James Baker, 89 to 92, I would argue was the last time the United States was admired, respected, and even feared in the world. Those three sets of policies, despite all the imperfections and transgressions that occurred in each of those periods, demonstrated American power in a way that I think was very, very effective. Now, what was the balance between interest and values? I made the assertion before, and I think I'm right, that values, and what do I mean by that? Respect for human rights, international law, democracy has never been, not that I can recall, the driving force in America's foreign policy. And despite Biden's rhetoric, it is not the driving force now. We needed the Egyptian government and its authoritarian leader, Abdel Fattah Sisi, to broker what may prove to be just a temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. We need the authoritarian Erdogan of Turkey, because we need Turkish troops to deploy at the Kabul airport in order to keep the embassy open. We are selling the UAE no human rights beacon, F-35s. They're paying for them, but we also have a very critically important military base, air base at Al Dhafra. The Qataris, again, certainly no paragon of human rights. We're going to need Al Udeid in the wake of our withdrawal from Afghanistan to fly crewed missions or drones to deal with our counterterrorism policy. And it's no coincidence that in the wake of the assassination of Mr. Navalny, the attempted assassination of Navalny, and a series of Russian renditions and poisonings, the first authoritarian that Biden met with is in Geneva with Vladimir Putin. So I don't know if there is. I'm pretty confident, actually, having spent 25 years in the government and trying to understand American foreign policy over the last 20, that there is no balance that is going to satisfy everyone on those issues. No balance that is certainly going to satisfy those who argue that we choose to accept international law when it's convenient and ignore it when it isn't. That we deal with authoritarian powers. Yes, we sometimes call them out on human rights, but the toughest relationships are not with the Russians and Chinese, who we are not assisting with millions or billions of dollars of military and economic aid. They're with what Roosevelt referred to in reference either to Haiti or the Dominican Republic. Yeah, they're sons of bitches, but they're quote unquote our sons of bitches. So I don't think there's a balance that's going to satisfy everyone. The question is whether or not there is some sort of balance that will protect, to a large degree, American interests and at least try to promote American values.
So let me.
Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of mine. He was supposed to come to the Wilson Center as a visiting Arab journalist. To say that I was angry in the wake of what Mohammed bin Salman ordered, is the understatement of the century. And I could not believe the degree to which the previous administration coddled, acquiesced, placated the Saudis. The Biden administration came into office determined to correct that. Well, to a certain degree they did, but did they really? I mean, there were no sanctions of MBS, and we've refrained from sanctioning world leaders, at least the ones that we're currently dealing with. But just last week, MBS's younger brother, Prince Khalid, the former ambassador, was here, saw Tony Blinken. So, I mean, again, I think anybody who expects that the United States is going to somehow consistently stand up for human rights, justice, and respect for democratic values in the world, I think is going to be always disappointed.
So let me ask a follow-up to really get specific here. President Biden's administration has upheld the designation of a genocide of the Uyghur people by the CCP government in the Xinjiang province. We actually had Miles Yuan, Pompeo's top China policy advisor in the State Department, who said that the Biden administration has taken a tougher stance on China, the CCP government, for the genocide and human rights. Actually, Aaron, just for everybody in the audience, we have the recording. We will publish it. He went and he was unabashedly praising the Biden administration, basically saying the opposite of Mike Pence's recent speech for bashing the Biden administration for being weak on China. Miles, you said they're being tough, and actually more tough because they're taking human rights kind of to another level. So on that note, when we have an issue like climate change that we need to work with China on, not only for our own existential safety, but from an existential point for the global world order, human rights on a mass scale, mitigating all of these things, how should the United States approach climate change when in China, through slave labor of the Uyghur people, there are many different products being produced and exported to the United States that are related to climate change? How should we approach the gravest of human rights violations while also still attempting to work with that country without completely undermining everything that is in our values and stated goal?
I don't think there's a neat RX prescription to do that. I just don't. I mean, we're not going to change Chinese behavior on the Uyghurs. Chinese are now very concerned about Afghanistan. Why? Because previous governments, Taliban, actually supported Uyghur groups. I just don't, and what the Chinese are doing is an abomination. I just don't think it's not a binary choice. John Kerry, who's the special envoy, climate czar, met with his counterpart in April. They signed a 2-page communique which pledged Chinese to help make the COP26 in Glasgow in November a success. I think you're going to have to live with, because we cannot resolve the Uyghur problem, it seems to me, just as we couldn't and can't resolve the problem of the Rohingya in Myanmar, nor are we able to resolve, and the administration, Tony Blinken, may have great regrets over the Obama administration's decisions on Syria. But we've chosen, as has the vaunted international community. And by the way, let's be clear here. You gotta on some of these issues turn the M in me upside down so it becomes a we. It's not just the United States, despite the fact that we put ourselves up as the shining city on the hill. And we tend to be the loudest when it comes to talking about human rights and democratic promotion. This is not just an issue for the United States. There is something called the international community, capital I, capital C. But if you look at the way the international community has responded to many of these human rights abuses and mass killings over the years, it's either been too preoccupied, too divided, too uninterested, not willing to take this on. And it comes back to the fundamental question of, can a single power or group of powers find a way to intercede in the internal affairs of another country in order to get them to fundamentally alter what goes on inside that country? And I can think of very few examples, certainly none using military force, where the United States, except with the exception of 1945 to 1950, where the United States actually used its military power and the projection of force to help restructure the affairs of another country, or at least to help them restructure it, as we did in Japan or in Europe in the wake of the Second World War. So it's emotionally unsatisfying. It's more than that for the human rights community. But I don't see a way out of this.
So then should we just ignore the gross human rights violations like we see in Zhejiang province? Or if we understand that we can't change the calculations, should we attempt to at least impose a cost to underline the values that we stand for and just make it more costly, or something else?
Well, that's presumably what we're trying to do with the Chinese, and Congress is on this case as well. I just, or take Putin. Let's take another example. Let's take Putin and ransomware, or Putin and the SVR's efforts to formally hack into the back office systems of American companies. There, you have a clear example of a threat. I mean, unlike the Uyghurs, this is a threat that directly involves the security and prosperity of the United States. And I would argue we are somehow unable and unwilling to respond in kind. Now, maybe that's going to change. But we now also, Justin, have a glass house problem. We have a glass house problem with respect to our vulnerabilities. Most of I don't know what the percentage is, of the power, electric, and water companies in this country are private sector owned, and a lot of them do not have cyber protections that are up to par. So that's one glass house. You want to go after the Russians? Okay. Just be prepared for an answer in kind. Then there's the other glass house problem. Not that we are doing anything remotely close to what the Chinese are doing against the Uyghurs or the former Burmese military against the Rohingya, but we are no longer, some would argue we never were, but our own political dysfunction and our own undermining of our own democratic values are now on display in a way that I would argue they never were before. And it influences and impacts on our credibility, our capacity to be believed, our credibility to be believed by other countries. Freedom House reported in 2019 that the world's two largest democracies, India and the United States, had seen the greatest deterioration of democratic values. The Economist, in its annual democracy index, downgraded the U.S. from the category of full democracy to flawed democracy. This is way back in 2017. This was way before the acute dysfunction in our political system was on display during this past several years of the Trump administration. Voter turnout in the U.S. ranks only 26th in the world. Public trust in our government institutions is at historical lows. 25% of all Americans and 53% of the Republicans believe that Trump won the 2020 election and he is the, quote, true president. And half of all Republicans say it was appropriate for state legislators to try to shift electoral votes to Trump in states that Biden won. So our allies are wonder whether or not in a few years we're going to toggle back to a different kind of, or the antipode of Joe Biden in the presidency. And our allies are quick to exploit the fact that to a large degree we look unbelievably hypocritical and unethical in the way we hold ourselves up as an example to the world. So all of these things serve, I think, as restraints and constant reminders about American leadership. I happen to believe that we are still the most consequential power on the planet. We have a better balance of economic, political, military, and soft power than any other country. But we really have to take a long look in the mirror before we assert propositions that somehow we must or should lead the free world with the capacity to tell others exactly what it is they should be doing. You know what they say, that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk. And my concern is that by casting the 21st century as a battle between Democrats and dictators, there are a lot of democracies, small and large, that don't see the world quite that way. And again, we're going to have to be very careful in the way we project. I come back to the final point in my judgment. It's not that foreign policy doesn't matter anymore. It's not that we can't play a role in the world. We must. But I just keep thinking that if we're going to be an indispensable power, the constituency that we need to be indispensable for is ourselves. And I try to understand and explain to folks who come here looking for American leadership to get them to understand the real challenges and threats that we face. Let me just read to you, just briefly, a quote by Abraham Lincoln a long time ago. He was 28 at the time. He gave a talk to Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield in 1838. And what Lincoln said in 1838 strikes me as so applicable to now. He says this: "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a single blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chests, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men," Lincoln writing in the 19th century, "we must live through all time or die by suicide." Foreign policy is important, critically important. We can still lead. But what ails us at home, fixing America's broken house, American security, American prosperity, security in the sense of our political identity, our capacity to govern ourselves, it's at risk, very serious risk. And that's the priority.
Yeah. Folks, this is Politics Media 101 with the Carnegie Endowment's Aaron David Miller. If you go to my Twitter account, we tweeted out his recent Washington Post op-ed about foreign policy and how Joe Biden should approach the world with regards to autocracies versus democracies versus values versus interests. And we've kind of gotten into that now. I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions here. We got about 30 minutes, if we can, to go through these questions. On that note, I'm going to call on people. Please respect that, be civil, and try and be quick with your questions. So we're going to start with Ting Ting. Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I have. Hi, Aaron. Thanks so much for insightful comments earlier. I'm Ting Ting. I'm a journalist based in Taiwan right now. So it's actually 1:42 a.m. here. But really, thanks so much for sharing so much with us. I do have a question, is that you noted how American interests dominate the crux of American foreign policy, and that's quite a concern for Taiwan. Currently, we are seeing how the US government stress important and similar values which Taiwan also shares. US-Taiwan relations is now often described as entering a new phase of honeymoon, but there is constant concern in Taiwan as to when will American interests be placed over the so-called values again, especially US-China relations are so intertwined. But at the same time, the PRC threat and pressure towards Taiwan is increasingly exponentially. So I just want to know what are your views on this. Thank you.
I think Taiwan presents a huge problem for the administration. It's clear that President Xi has, in many respects, upped the ante, increasing the activity of the Chinese military near Taiwan. He's introduced the notion of reunification, even by force, within the Chinese Communist Party. There are a lot of American military planners who believe that while a threat is not imminent, that it is now conceivable. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The Biden administration, I think, is still wrestling with what to do. There are those whom I know and respect who argue that we should remove the strategic ambiguity of our policy and make it unmistakably clear what we would do in response to a concerted Chinese effort to up the military pressure on Taiwan, one through military and airstrikes to eliminate Taiwan's defenses, to an effort through a naval blockade to cut off the island, and three, if it got that serious, Chinese attacks on American missile deployments. I have a mixed feeling on whether or not making it unmistakably clear to the world what we would do in the event the Chinese developed any of those things or implemented any of the things I outlined, whether or not that would embolden the Chinese, whether it would rally the forces of nationalism in Taiwan to believe that we would almost certainly come to the defense of Taiwan and be willing, and I say this not lightly, be willing to engage in direct military activity against China in order to defend Taiwan. I haven't seen the polling, but if you ask the majority of the American public right now, are you willing to go to war with China over Taiwan? I think the results would be pretty stunning in terms of the unwillingness of most Americans to defend Taiwan if it meant war with China. And again, presumably we're talking about a conventional military action, not nuclear. So this is a problem that is going to, in my judgment, Taiwan and China have avoided a confrontation now for 70 years, at least a direct military confrontation that presaged an effort to reunite Taiwan with the People's Republic. It's impossible to know what Xi is thinking. He'd have to weigh the balance of international isolation and, again, the reaction of the United States and the international community. This goes beyond the Uyghurs. It goes beyond Hong Kong. It would be a profound challenge to the international system and order, not to mention Taiwan's sovereignty. So I'm not sure we've seen the last word on this from the Biden administration. But if I'm correct, that risk aversion seems to be the dominant strain in the administration's foreign policy. That is to say, focusing largely on matters related to American security and prosperity. I suspect that they will proceed relatively cautiously. Remember, we're 6 to 7 months into an administration that is still has, in my judgment, no China policy, and it's going to have to figure out what it's going to do with respect to China, and Taiwan is going to be a part of that.
Thank you for that question, Ting Ting, and the answer, Aaron. Next, we will go to Donna, and then we will go to a new voice on stage that we haven't seen before. We'll go to Muhammad G. I can't pronounce your last name, but Donna, over to you.
Aaron, thank you so much for being here. I'll ask a little bit about the digital yuan and whether or not you see this as also upping the ante in terms of control and tracking, not so much of the Chinese public, but throughout Africa and South America, it's been talked about a lot, that this will be ways in which they track the money by paying for goods and services or other kinds of ways in which the Chinese are engaged in those areas. And do you think that this is something that the U.S. is prepared for, and technologically, and the ability to move in the same way that the Chinese have already evidenced that they are? Thank you.
Not sure I can respond, Donna, to that question. I know what I know, and it's clearly an area and a subject I'm going to have to learn more about.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Donna. We will go to Mohammed next. If you could just, be quick and simple with it. That's the two rules. There you go, Mohammed.
I don't know if you mean myself.
Yes,
or
you. Sorry. Yeah, you.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, thank you, Adam, for being here. My question concerns the Middle East and especially Lebanon and Syria. So, is the current administration viewing Lebanon as a major player on its foreign policy, knowing that it's the host country of Hezbollah? And would you say that the negotiations going on in Vienna right now also include the new vision of the United States concerning the natural gas fields that are in the Middle East, that they were revealed in 2010 in the Obama administration? And my last point is, can we say today that I don't want to say the division, but the role of Syria in the region now, it's in the eyes of the United States a geopolitical conflict between regional countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and widely Russia, and the United States is no more interested in Syrian politics. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the Lebanese, Syrian, Iranian triangle, because it's all, well, and you'd have to throw in the Israelis here as well, is obviously a potential problem which could escalate into serious confrontation, either through a high trajectory war using Hezbollah's weapons and Israeli preemption or counterstrikes, or in the event that the nuclear issue is somehow not restrained through reentry into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, could result in an Israeli-Iranian military confrontation, which could involve the United States. I think that's clearly an issue that is front and center on the administration's priorities. At the same time, against the backdrop of American withdrawal from Afghanistan and our limited deployment in Syria, which is now, frankly, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 American forces designed largely to deal with a counterterrorism mission against the Islamic State and its derivatives. Some would argue that it's somehow, including Iraq, a deterrent to Iranian influence there. But if it is, it really isn't working. Iraq is vital to Iran's national security, far more important even than Syria, but Syria is extremely important as it looks to project its influence throughout the region, as is Lebanon. So there, I think the issue is more managing and trying to preempt the possibilities of a major confrontation rather than a serious effort on the part of the United States to involve itself in the internal politics of Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon with a view of somehow addressing the dysfunction that exists in all three of those countries. I think it's really important to understand the impact that Iraq and Afghanistan and 20 years, particularly as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, has had on the thinking of elites in this country as well as this administration. And I think it has created, which is, I think, one of the reasons that the mission creep in Afghanistan and the decision to invade Iraq was such a strategic blunder. It is reinforced a degree of risk aversion, which has made the United States extremely reticent and hesitant about involving themselves, even politically and economically, in the internal politics of any of these countries. These two wars constituted a kind of $1 trillion social science project, and I don't mean to trivialize the thousands of Americans who've died and received life-crushing injuries, or frankly, the thousands of Iraqis and Afghans who died as a consequence. But by almost every measure, the decision to project American military power after the initial successes in the fall of 2001 in weakening al-Qaeda and undermining the influence of the Taliban, all of these successes or promised successes have not materialized. Certainly that's the case in Afghanistan. And the sense of wariness that has produced, I think, to some degree has caused an over-course correction. So if you asked me right now to identify the three core vital American interests in the Middle East, as opposed to the discretionary interests, they would all relate to American security and prosperity. Number one, to the extent we can, not through the deployment of thousands of American military forces, but through other means of counterterrorism and coordination by, with, and through, and our other allies, preventing another attack on the continent of the United States. That's number one. And number two, even though we are weaning our dependence off of Arab hydrocarbons, it has become, on paper, the largest producer of oil in the world, the rest of the world continues to depend on Arab hydrocarbons and will for the foreseeable future. And since oil trades in a single market, that means a disruption of supply in country X leads to implications in country Y, Europe, and ultimately here. And finally, the prevention of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. The rest, however important it may be, ending the Syrian civil war, making Iraq more functional, dealing with Yemen, solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't mean to trivialize any of these, but I would go so far as to say that none of them, and I could add a few more to the list, are going to be priorities for this administration. And much of that risk aversion, that sense of retrenchment, is a function of a terribly misguided decision in the wake of 9/11. Not so much in Afghanistan. There it was a question of an evolving mission, which, in my judgment, there winning in Afghanistan was never possible by any conventional standard. Winning was essentially the act of leaving and trying to determine what we would leave behind. All of that has made Middle East as a whole much less, not attractive, but much less an area where the United States believes that its fundamental interests are somehow threatened. And add to that a rising China and the dysfunction at home, and you clearly have a United States that looks at this entire region as a kind of second order priority. Now, it can change, as anyone who looks at this region knows. I'm reminded of one of my favorite rock groups was the Eagles. One of their best and most iconic songs was Hotel California. And the one line in that song, which applies to this region, is the one that says, you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. And the Biden administration got a reminder of that in May as a consequence of a number of misguided Israeli policies in and around Jerusalem, which ultimately was hijacked by Hamas. And you had a mini war which required some American involvement. But this administration is not looking to play a major seminal role in ending any of the conflicts here, with one exception, and that is trying to find a way to stabilize the relationship between the United States and Iran on the nuclear issue.
Thank you for that, Aaron. We will go to two more questions, folks. And then if you didn't get a chance to speak, but you're on stage or you have your hand raised after Aaron leaves, we will go to everybody on stage to hear their views on what Aaron just outlined, the way he presented the information. It's more like a focus group. And then after that, we might also do a popcorn discussion. But on that note, I did want to go to Evan and then another new voice. We love when we have new voices in the club. Sorry, there's a ambulance in the background. We love when we have new voices. We'll go to Evan and then Hessam to kind of bring us home here. Evan, over to you, good sir.
Thanks, Justin. Aaron, I'd be interested in your opinion regarding Trump's Middle East policy. And I'm no fan, trust me, but what did he get right? Or was it beginner's luck when it came to opening up the Israeli dialogue with the UAE and Saudi? And do you see that momentum continuing in any fashion?
Yeah, Evan, thanks. It's a great question. I just mentioned there's an unnamed American newspaper that is doing a short feature on what Trump got right, and I was asked to contribute to that when it comes out, probably within a week or so. And I wrote about this in the Washington Post. And I mean, there are those people who worked in government for a very long time who have a very difficult time looking in the mirror and basically saying to themselves, we missed the boat on this. We didn't get this right. We screwed up. And I've spent I left State Department in March of 2003. And I spent the last 18 years in the public conversation trying to come to terms personally with what I was responsible for not getting right, and what we, through Republican and Democratic administrations, did not get right. And there are many things. All right, I have not given up hope in the possibility, strange as it may seem to many of you, in a conflict and an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, but I've given up most of my illusions. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post 6 months ago. It wasn't so much a confession, but it was an honest sort of admission that we had missed, because of our analysis and the conviction that the Arab states were so, both by ideology and self-interest, so tethered to the problem of Palestine that there could be no serious, forget formal diplomatic recognition before there was significant progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But the prospects of even warming relations outside of the relations that the Israelis had with Egypt, the two peace treaties with Egypt and Israel, and Jordan and Israel. And I think there's no doubt. And again, we could spend the next hour talking about what the Trump administration did both to undermine this republic and our foreign policy. But there's no doubt that capitalizing on trends that had been building, driven largely by three things: a rising fear of Iran, a rising frustration with a divided Palestinian national movement, and a desire to improve relations in Washington, that the Trump administration willfully, Jared Kushner approached me in 2017 and 2018 and invited me for discussions to hear my views. I'm not entirely persuaded he was listening, but that was okay, because in his judgment, and he said as much, we had basically failed. And his own view, and he made it very clear, was that they were going to develop what he defined as strategic relations with the Emiratis and the Saudis. And they were far more interested. Now, this is my words, not his, but I think it's a fair description. They were much more interested in what I called the 22-state solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict rather than the two-state solution. That is to say, the 22 members of the Arab League. So they cultivated willfully, to a fault in my judgment, relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, giving the Saudis a margin of maneuver unprecedented. And I watched Republican Democratic administrations deal with Saudi Arabia for almost 30 years. The first book I ever wrote was on the history of the U.S.-Saudi relationship during the 40s and 50s. But they gave the Emiratis and the Saudis a degree they created a zone of immunity in which essentially they could do, the Saudis in particular, could do whatever they wanted. And the reckless and ruthless Mohammed bin Salman was glad to take them up on that offer. But nonetheless, the personal relationships and the policies they pursued, building on discrete relations between Israel and the Emiratis, and Israel and the Bahrainis, and Israel and the Saudis over the last decade and a half, driven by the three things I mentioned: fear of Iran, frustration with the Palestinians, and a desire to improve their stock in Washington. They cultivated willfully these relationships and produced what, frankly, I never believed would have been possible. Not just full diplomatic relations, based on quid pro quos to a large extent. The Bahrainis got commitments on military and support for their position on Iran. The Emiratis got F-35s. Moroccans were not part of the initial Abraham Accords, ended up with an administration statement validating Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. Sudan got off the terrorism list, which frankly they probably deserved anyway. But beyond that, you've got 200,000 Israelis visiting Dubai, in the last year. You've got a degree of familiarity and intimacy between Israel and the Emirates. The Israeli national anthem is sung. The Israeli flag is flown. I mean, it's extraordinary. Within a year, what's happened in those two countries. Now, remember, they are outside the conflict zone. You weren't going to get that kind of warm relationship between Israel and Egypt or Israel and Jordan for many reasons. And you also will not get the kind of return you can get. It was Egypt, not the Emiratis or the Qataris or the Saudis, obviously, that played the critical role in brokering the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas on the third week in May. But if you asked me to identify a huge accomplishment on the part of the Trump administration, that was it. It came at a considerable price, but I think you'd have to be interminably obtuse or so ideologically biased not to recognize that that was a signal accomplishment. Now, how many more will join the party is unclear. I don't see the Omanis or the Qataris lining up to establish relations with Israel, let alone the Saudis. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for that.
Thank you for that, Aaron. We're running up against it, but I did want to give one more new person an opportunity to answer the question. I thought interminably obtuse was a hilarious way to say an absolute complete moron. I like that. And folks, that's why he was a diplomat and I was not. But on that note, we will go to Hassam here. Please ask Mr. Aaron David Miller the question that you have.
Thank you, Justin. My question is about the U.S.-Iran relations. We all know that Mr. Biden promised to rejoin Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, following he comes to office. It's about now 6 months. The U.S. and 5+1 negotiating with Iran in terms of the return. And we know that we are in very critical situation that Iran is starting enrichment uranium up to 20% and now 60%. And because of this failure, we facing a situation that the U.S. may not return to JCPOA following the Mr. Trump's withdrawal in 2018. And we also know that a new conservative government, newly elected conservative government is going to office in 2 weeks' time. So we are in a very bad situation. And why Mr. Biden negotiating again for 6 months, despite he promised in his presidential election to return without any condition to the Iran nuclear deal? Thank you so much.
Yeah, Hassam, thank you. I mean, I can only tell you based on years of negotiating that in the Middle East, negotiations basically have two speeds, slow and slower. And I don't think there was any way that this arrangement could have happened quickly. Now, the fact that it's dragged on, the fact that you had a presidential election in Iran, and Ibrahim Raisi is supposed to be sworn in on August 3rd. The Iranians have told the Americans flat out last week that there would be no return to the negotiations until the presidential inauguration was complete. The obstacles, in my judgment, flow from politics more than anything else. on each side. Yes, there are a lot of complexities as a consequence of the sanctions that Trump imposed. Yes, the Iranians have made additional advances with respect to advanced centrifuges, and now they're producing metallic uranium, which is apparently extremely important in a weaponization process. But I would argue that at least as of now, mid-July, return to the JCPOA is still possible, and that the agreement, even though it has many detractors who argue that it's become obsolete, who argue that it doesn't include Iran's ballistic missiles, who argue that it doesn't include Iran's human rights abuses, who argue that it doesn't include Iran's activities in the region, in Syria and Iraq, which will not be included in this agreement. Otherwise, there'll be no deal. I still think that the odds of reaching an agreement still outweigh the odds of not, assuming that once Raisi is inaugurated, negotiations resume, and both sides are committed to it. It may well be, again, I said politics are important on each side. It may well be that the Iranians are waiting until Raisi's inauguration in order to put their own stamp on an issue related to the agreement. That is to say, to be able to demonstrate to the world that you see under the new regime, not under the Rouhani Zarif regime, but under the regime of the new president, more conservative president, Raisi, we got something more from the Americans. There's also the matter of hostages, which has now caused a minor flare-up. The Iranians claim the agreement has been reached. They're ready to do it today. The American side is charging them with falsifying that account. So that's just another complication. But I would say there's a reasonable chance that an agreement could be reached in August or September. If it goes beyond that, then it's much more serious. I would only conclude by saying this is a transaction. It's not a transformation. The logic behind this accord was, from the beginning, was to try to preempt an Israeli-Iranian military confrontation and make American involvement in that confrontation impossible, to avoid war. I don't think the logic here has changed. It does not address the issue of Iran's nuclear pretensions. It does not address any of the other issues, which will continue to be a source of great concern, largely to the American political establishment. Just one last point. I guarantee you that if this agreement is reached, there will be no champagne corks popping in Washington. Because as I can see it, this agreement may serve to stabilize the nuclear issue for a while longer. But it's not going to satisfy the critics, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side, who think that JCPOA was permanently flawed. If you ask me, it's a flawed agreement, but it's still functional. And frankly, we'd be better off trying to limit and constrain Iran's nuclear program than without it.
That's all we have for you today on Politics and Media 101. Thank you again very much for joining us. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of my co-founder, Justin Higgins, and I, we're both very grateful to you for being here. Again, if you like what you hear, if you want to hear past episodes, if you want to see our schedule of upcoming guests, maybe ask one of them a question, or if you have thoughts, feedback, suggestions, criticisms for us, please go to our website, pm101.live, where you can find all that and more. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.